For our final project, we wanted to explore the differences between a violin and a viola. To do this, we established two main goals. The first is to compare a note played on the violin to the same note played on the viola in order to identify the differences between the sound waveforms. The second objective of ours is to connect what we see in our sound wave analysis to the physical and auditory differences we observe between the violin and viola. So before we talk about the quantitative data we gathered from our analysis, let's get familiar with the background and a little bit of history of these two instruments and why they sound different in the first place. There are four main differences between the violin and the viola. The first biggest difference is the strings that are on both of the instruments. The violin has an E string on the upper end, which the viola doesn't have, and the viola has a C string on the lower end, which the violin doesn't have. A full-size violin is 14 inches long, and violas there's not really a full-size viola. You just measure the viola to your arm length. So most violinists that play a 14-inch violin would play a 15-inch viola. The violin typically has really thin strings because they're higher pitched, and the viola typically has thicker strings because they play lower, deeper notes. This also affects the sound. Violin can sound really shrill sometimes, while a viola pretty much always has a mellow tone. The next biggest difference between the violin and the viola is the clef that they play in. The viola plays in the alto clef, and the violin plays in the treble clef. Some of the similarities between a violin and viola are the number of strings. They both have 4 strings. They're both shoulder instruments played on the left shoulder. They're both bowed. And there's a bridge that transfers the sound from the vibrating strings to the wooden body of the instrument. Violins and violas, well, all string instruments also need rosin, which is refined, like hardened, dried tree sap, and you rub it on the bow hairs to make the bow sticky, and it will stick to the strings for better vibration.
In class, we invested a good portion of our time into learning about why and how different instruments can produce notes of the same frequency that have different tone qualities. For our experiment, we wanted to focus on comparing the timbre of the violin to the timbre of the viola. To do this, we carefully recorded the G and D strings on both instruments and used MATLAB to make a more in-depth analysis between the two different instruments' tone qualities, otherwise known as timbre. So, in the music building here on campus, we utilized the practice rooms that they provide. We used an iPhone 7 Plus quality microphone to record Anna playing both notes G and D on the violin and viola. We used the sound from that video to analyze the frequencies on MATLAB between each note on each instrument. In the following clips, we will observe Anna playing the G and D strings on both the violin and the viola. Listen closely to the differences. We will revisit the auditory differences when we discuss the results. This first clip is the G string on the violin. And here is the G string on the viola. Keep in mind that even though these tones sound slightly different, they have the same fundamental frequency. Next, we will compare the D strings on the violin and the viola. Here is Anna playing the D string on the violin. And here she is playing the D string on the viola. To further analyze these sounds, we converted the audio portions of these videos into WAV files and wrote a few simple programs in MATLAB to create a visualization of these different waveforms. Here you see some of the MATLAB code before it is compiled. For each note played, the WAV file is first transformed into an extremely large set of sample points representing the amplitude of the waveform at a given time. From this, we are able to plot the waveform of each note. Next, we utilize a method built into the MATLAB language that performs a Fourier transform, which we can use to plot the amplitude as a function of frequency instead of time. This will better help us to compare the timbres of the two instruments as we discuss the results.
Alright, so here we have a zoomed in visualization of the waveforms for the G and D string on both the violin and the viola. On the far right side, over here, we can see a direct comparison between the two instruments playing the D on the top and the G string on the bottom. While both the instruments are playing the same note, it is obvious that these two waveforms are different. In class, we learned that all sound waveforms are comprised of a number of sine waves, which vary in frequency and amplitude. So, to take a closer look at what makes up these waveforms, we utilized the Fourier transform method included in the MATLAB language, which is illustrated in these four graphs over here. So the important thing to understand about this method of waveform analysis is that these graphs are not dependent on time. Instead, these graphs plot the amplitude as a function of frequency. So we have frequency on the x-axis here, and we have the amplitude of each of the fundamental frequency and the harmonics down over here, so on the y-axis. And because of this, we can look at the amplitude of the harmonics of the fundamental frequency, which makes it easier to compare the tone color of each instrument. So let's take a closer look at the D string on the violin versus the D string on the viola. So I'm just going to display two right here. So first the D string on the violin and the D string on the viola, the transformed versions. Alright, so here you can see that for both instruments, the fundamental frequency is the same. It's just in between 0 and 2 times 10 to the third power, which is 2,000. So we're looking at about 1,000 hertz here, I believe. And that frequency is the same. And where it becomes different is when we start looking at the harmonics. So when we look at these spikes following the fundamental frequency, we're seeing a different pattern. And it is this idea that makes the tone color or timbre of the violin different from the tone color or timbre of the viola. The physical differences between the violin and the viola, such as size, thickness of strings, and string tension, they produce this different synthesis of the harmonics to the fundamental frequency, and that's ideally why they sound different, but yet still play the same note.
Throughout this project, we learned a lot about how to analyze sound waves and why a single note played on two different instruments can sound surprisingly different. We also found it interesting to explore the physical differences between a violin and a viola, and how this gives the two instruments a completely different sound and purpose. And through the process of using MATLAB to deconstruct waveforms, we also got an idea to how we could synthesize different waves electronically to replicate the sound of a violin or a viola. This is a very interesting subject that we touched on in class, so the opportunity to explore the mechanics behind it was very intriguing. We think that this research project was a great way to top off the class, and we had a lot of fun going through with it. Thank you for watching our presentation.